My name is Elias, and the world has shrunk to this clapboard shack on Fog Point. My companions are the pressure release of the wind, the endless crash of the Atlantic, and the equipment, a Marconi coherer, a tangle of wires, and a humming dynamo that fills the air with the sharp scent of ozone. My job is to sit for 12-hour shifts, the headset clamped to my ears, and pluck strands of Morse code from the roaring sea of atmospheric static. But there's a sound beneath the chaos, a deep rhythmic pulse that isn't in any manual. It's a slow benthic cadence, like a heartbeat the size of a mountain. The outgoing operator, a man with mechanically compromised hollow eyes, just called it spherics, and told me not to chase it. You're here for the ships, he'd said, not the sea itself. The Marconi Wireless Telegraph. Company of Canada established the Fog Point station in February 1904 to provide maritime communication services along the treacherous Nova Scotia coastline, where the Labrador Current met the Gulf Stream and generated fog banks of such density that ships disappeared from visual range at distances of less than 50 yards. The station consisted of the operator's shack, a coal shed, and the aerial mast, a wooden tower 120 feet tall that supported the copper antenna wire stretching skyward into the perpetual grey. My employment contract specified 12-hour shifts, 6 days weekly, at a salary of $18 monthly plus lodging and coal for heating. The lodging was a single room attached to the shack's eastern wall, furnished with an iron bedstead, a washstand, and a paraffin stove for preparing meals from the supplies delivered fortnightly by the company's wagon from Halifax. The outgoing operator was named Corbett. I met him during the 4-hour overlap required for training, though calling it training overstated the process. Corbett sat me before the equipment and demonstrated the basic operations with the mechanical precision of a man who had performed these actions thousands of times and now executed them without conscious thought. The coherer, a glass tube filled with iron filings that detected incoming electromagnetic waves, connected to the headset through a relay system that translated the wireless signals into audible clicks. The key for transmitting sat to the right of the coherer, a brass lever mounted on a mahogany base that closed the circuit when depressed, sending pulses of electromagnetic energy up the antenna wire and out across the ocean. The dynamo provided electrical power, a cast-iron machine the size of a steamer trunk that had to be hand-cranked every 4 hours to maintain the storage batteries at operational voltage. The ships transmit their positions at scheduled intervals, Corbett said, his voice flat and effectless. You log each transmission in the ledger with the time, the ship's identifier, and the coordinates. If a ship sends distress signals, you acknowledge receipt and relay the information to Halifax via the landline telephone. He gestured to the wooden telephone box mounted on the shack's western wall. Pittsburgh Press, May 12, 1907. Collapsed scaffolding injures 3. Its crank handle worn smooth by use. That's the work. You listen, you log, you relay. Everything else is spherics. Spherics? I asked. Corbett's expression darkened. Atmospheric interference. Lightning generates electromagnetic pulses that sound like static in the headset. The company manual calls them spherics. You'll hear them constantly, crackling, hissing, sometimes patterns that almost sound like code but aren't. The ocean generates its own interference too. Magnetic anomalies from mineral deposits on the seabed. Temperature gradients in the water. The manual attributes all non-signal sounds to natural phenomena that can be safely ignored. He handed me the headset, and I positioned the leather-padded receivers over my ears. The sound was immediately overwhelming, a roaring chaos of static punctuated by sharp crackles and distant pops, like standing inside a thunderstorm while simultaneously listening to 1,000 bacon pans spitting grease. Buried within this cacophony, I could occasionally discern the regular clicking patterns of Morse code, ships transmitting their positions. VMQR 4432N 63.7W. Steaming Halifax. The signals emerged from the background noise for a few seconds, then vanished back into the static. And beneath it all, exactly as I described to begin this account, was the pulse. It was not loud. It did not override the other sounds. But it was present, a deep rhythmic throb that seemed to originate from a layer of perception below the normal auditory range, felt as much as heard, like the vibration of a distant engine transmitted through the building's structure into one's bones. The pulse, I said. That deep rhythm. What is that? Corbett took the headset from my hands with a movement that was almost violent in its speed. I told you, Spherix, don't chase it. You're here for the ships, not the sea itself. He stood abruptly, gathering his few possessions, a canvas bag containing spare clothes, a leather-bound book I never saw him read, and moved toward the door. The company wagon comes Wednesdays. They bring your supplies and collect the week's logs. Don't miss the scheduled transmissions. Don't let the batteries die. Don't... He paused with his hand on the door handle. When you sleep, keep the headset off. The silence is worse than the noise, but you need the silence to stay functional. He left. I heard his boots on the wooden steps, then the crunch of gravel as he walked down the path toward the main road where the company wagon would collect him. I was alone then with the equipment and the wind and the pulse that Corbett insisted was merely Spherix, but which I already knew was something else. Something that operated according to principles the Marconi Company's engineering specifications did not acknowledge. The station log was a leather-bound ledger with columns for time, ship identifier, position and remarks. I reviewed the entries from the previous months, learning the rhythms of maritime traffic along this section of coast. The steamship Laurentia transmitted position reports every 4 hours during its regular run between Halifax and St. John's. The fishing fleet from Lunenburg checked in twice daily. The mail packet Sable Island maintained contact during its weekly circuit. Corbett's handwriting filled the pages with neat, precise entries that documented each transmission with bureaucratic thoroughness. But in the remarks column I found anomalies, small notations that violated the ledger's otherwise sterile record-keeping. Heavy Spherix 0300-0400, unusual interference pattern 1700. Coherer required repeated tapping to maintain sensitivity. And then, in entries from the past week, remarks that seemed to reference something beyond technical observations, pulse intensifying, pattern emerging from background, counting intervals, not random. The final entry, dated the previous night, simply read, "Request immediate relief, operator. Cannot continue." I examined the equipment more carefully. The coherer sat in its brass housing, the glass tube visible through the inspection window. The iron filings inside appeared normal, though I had no baseline for comparison. The batteries showed adequate charge. The antenna wire ascending the mast outside seemed properly tensioned. The dynamo's flywheel turned smoothly when I cranked the handle, building up rotational energy that the generator converted into electrical current. Everything functioned as designed. Yet Corbett had fled this station with the desperate urgency of a man escaping imminent danger, and the equipment itself seemed to hum with a potential that exceeded its documented specifications. I settled into the operator's chair, a wooden seat with a curved back that positioned me directly before the coherer and the key. The headset went on, and the ocean's electromagnetic chaos flooded my hearing. I began the evening's work, logging the scheduled transmissions as ships reported their positions through the fog and darkness. The Laurentia at 8 miles p.m., steaming northeast at 12 knots. The fishing schooner Mary Catherine at 8:30, anchored off Sambro Island. The coastal freighter Atlantic Dawn at 9:15, experiencing heavy seas but maintaining course. And beneath each transmission, beneath the crackle of lightning Spherix and the hiss of atmospheric noise, the pulse continued its slow, benthic rhythm. I found myself counting the intervals between beats, approximately 17 seconds. Not precisely 17. The interval varied slightly, ranging from 16 to 18 seconds, but maintaining an average that suggested intentionality rather than randomness. I consulted the Marconi Company's technical manual, a thick volume bound in black cloth that occupied a shelf above the equipment bench. The section on atmospheric interference describes Spherix as random electromagnetic pulses generated by lightning discharges, their timing determined by meteorological conditions and therefore exhibiting no regular periodicity. The pulse I heard was not random. It was rhythmic, consistent, and growing more distinct the longer I listened. By 10 toward p.m., I could distinguish textural variations within each pulse, a rising phase, a plateau, a declining phase. That suggested a complex waveform rather than the simple spike of a lightning discharge. By midnight, I had begun to perceive harmonics, overtones that accompanied the fundamental pulse like sympathetic vibrations in a musical instrument. I removed the headset and sat in the sudden silence, my ears ringing from the sustained assault of electromagnetic noise. The shack's interior was illuminated by a single kerosene lamp that cast shadows from the equipment and created pools of darkness in the corners. Outside, the wind had increased, rattling the clapboard walls and causing the antenna wire to sing with a high, thin note that penetrated the building's structure. As documented in the Journal of Industrial Medicine, volume 14, 1903, the human auditory system can exhibit temporary threshold shifts from prolonged noise exposure, explaining the operator's subjective experience. The ocean crashed against the rocks below Fog Point, with the rhythmic percussion that had been the soundtrack to my first day at the station. I prepared a simple meal, tinned beef, ship's biscuit, tea brewed on the paraffin stove, and ate while reviewing the station's inventory records. The coal shed contained sufficient fuel for approximately 6 weeks. The food stores would last a month if I maintained the recommended rations. Spare parts for the equipment filled a wooden crate beneath the bench. Coherer tubes, battery acid, copper wire, solder, various tools. The company had equipped the station for extended autonomous operation, assuming that weather or mechanical failure might delay the weekly supply wagon. But nothing in the inventory addressed the possibility of an operator's psychological deterioration, which I suspected was the actual reason for Corbett's departure. The isolation was profound. The nearest dwelling was 4 miles distant, a farmhouse occupied by a family I had not yet met. The main road saw perhaps 1 vehicle daily. The company wagon's weekly visit represented the only guaranteed human contact. For 6 days between visits, the operator existed in a bubble of solitude, with only the electromagnetic voices of distant ships for company, and beneath those voices, the pulse that was not supposed to exist, but which nevertheless throbbed with the regularity of a vast submerged heart. I returned to the headset at 1 a.m. to monitor the scheduled transmission from the mail packet Sable Island. The signal arrived punctually, the operator's practiced hand sending clean, crisp Morse, CGSI, 3355 again 60 or 12W. Mails delivered Sable Island. Returning Halifax, I logged the transmission and acknowledged receipt, my own hand on the key feeling clumsy compared to the packet's professional operator. The pulse had changed during my meal break. The interval between beats had shortened to approximately 14 seconds. The harmonics had become more pronounced, creating a complex chord that seemed to contain information I could almost but not quite decode. I found myself leaning forward in the chair, straining to hear details within the sound, chasing patterns that emerged briefly from the electromagnetic chaos before dissolving back into noise. I caught myself. Corbett's warning echoed in my memory. Don't chase it. The pulse was doing exactly what I had been, hired to resist, drawing my attention away from the legitimate work of monitoring ship traffic and toward a phenomenon that the company classified as ignorable interference. I forced myself to focus on the scheduled transmissions, logging each ship's position with disciplined precision, deliberately ignoring the pulse that continued its slow rhythm beneath the static. But the pulse did not ignore me. By 3 a.m., it had intensified to the point where it dominated the background noise, a presence so powerful that I felt it in my chest, my breathing unconsciously synchronizing with its rhythm. The harmonics had resolved into what sounded like layers, multiple pulses at different frequencies, all maintaining the same basic tempo, but creating interference patterns that waxed and waned like tides. I pulled the headset off and walked outside, needing to confirm that the sound was electromagnetic and not acoustic, not some physical vibration traveling through the station's structure. The November wind cut through my wool coat with the casual brutality of maritime climate. The ocean was invisible in the darkness, but audible as a constant roar punctuated by the explosive impact of waves against rocks. The antenna mast swayed slightly, the wire humming with tension. Industrial Safety Memorandum 47B. Regarding structural integrity in high-wind marine environments, all mast anchorages must be inspected bi-weekly. Above, the sky was overcast, no stars visible, just the uniform grey of cloud cover that perpetually obscured this coastline. I heard nothing that corresponded to the pulse. The ocean's rhythm was chaotic, individual waves arriving at irregular intervals. The wind varied constantly, There was no external acoustic source that could account for the regular 14-second throb I heard through the headset. The pulse existed only in the electromagnetic spectrum, transmitted by some source and received by the Marconi apparatus with the same fidelity that it received ship transmissions. I returned inside and cranked the dynamo, bringing the batteries back to full charge. The physical labor helped clear my mind. Corbett had worked this station for 8 months before requesting relief. 8 months of 12-hour shifts, 6 days weekly, sitting in this chair with the headset clamped to his ears, listening to the pulse grow stronger and more complex until he could no longer maintain the pretense that it was merely atmospheric interference. 8 months of isolation, and the slow realization that the ocean itself was broadcasting something, and that the Marconi equipment designed to facilitate human communication was also capable of receiving transmissions from sources the company's engineers had never anticipated. Pittsburgh Press, July 28, 1908. Industrial Fatality Report. Powerhouse boiler explosion kills 1. The fishing fleet began checking in at 4 a.m. Their transmissions brief and workmanlike. VCFM. Position 44 1 day 10, 6345W. 200 LBS cod. I logged each vessel, maintaining my professional obligations while the pulse continued its relentless rhythm beneath the fishermen's practical communications. By 6 a.m., when my shift ended and the day operator was scheduled to arrive, except there was no day operator, the company having apparently decided that a single operator per station was sufficient economy, had logged 17 ship transmissions and filled 3 pages of the ledger with position coordinates and routine remarks. I had also begun to count. The pulse had increased its tempo again. The interval was now approximately 11 seconds. If the pattern continued, if the pulse was indeed accelerating, then at some calculable point in the future, it would achieve a frequency that might correspond to something recognizable, some rate that would transform it from an ambiguous throb into a signal whose structure and content could be analyzed. I did not record this observation in the official log. Instead, I opened a separate notebook, one of several blank journals included in my personal effects, and began maintaining a parallel record. Time of observation, pulse interval, harmonic structure, subjective intensity, any correlations with weather conditions, ship traffic or equipment status. Industrial Safety Memorandum. 12th ZID. Procedures for documenting unusual equipment performance or operator stress, noting that deviations from protocol must be formally reported for institutional review. I understood that I was doing exactly what Corbett had warned against. I was chasing the pulse, allowing it to become the focus of my attention. But I also understood that the pulse was real, that it represented a phenomenon beyond the Marconi Company's official acknowledgement, and that documenting it might be the only way to maintain my own sanity during the months of isolation that stretched ahead. The sun rose at 7:23 a.m., not that it brought much illumination. The fog that gave Fog Point its name had settled thick over the coastline. Pittsburgh Press, November 19, 1910. Marine disaster off Newfoundland. Liner reported missing in dense fog, reducing visibility to perhaps 20 feet. I ate breakfast, porridge prepared on the paraffin stove, tea and apple from the previous week's supplies, and attempted sleep. Corbett's advice about removing the headset proved sound. Without the constant assault of electromagnetic noise, I could hear the station's normal sounds. Wind in the eaves, waves on the rocks, the tick of cooling metal in the dynamo. As documented in the Journal of Industrial Medicine, Vol. 22, 1911, REM cycle disruption in isolated environments can manifest as a specific symptom of neurological and psychological dysfunction. These acoustic rhythms lulled me into unconsciousness, despite my mind's continued preoccupation with the pulse and its implications. As documented in the Journal of Industrial Medicine, Volume 8, 1892, prolonged auditory stimulus in isolated operatives can induce symptomatic neurological irregularities. I dreamed of depth, of pressure, of vast spaces filled with water and something else, something that moved through the ocean's benthic layers with the slow inevitability of currents and tides. The dream had no visual component, only sensation, the weight of water, the cold of abyssal depths, the pulse that was simultaneously inside and outside my perception, a rhythm that preceded and would outlast human measurement. I woke at 2:11 p.m. with the certainty that the pulse was not generated by atmospheric conditions or geological formations or any natural phenomenon the Marconi technical manual would recognize. The pulse was intentional. It was a broadcast. And the equipment humming in the shack's main room was receiving a transmission from something that had been signaling long before Marconi's wireless apparatus existed to detect it, and would continue signaling long after the Fog Point station and the Marconi Company and human civilization itself had dissolved back into the elements from which they emerged. The ventilation ducts of the asylum hummed, a low, metallic thrum that resonated deep within the bones of its occupants. Dr. Alistair Finch meticulously wiped his spectacles, the sterile scent of carbolic acid clinging to his jacket. Outside his office window, a perpetual fog thick as rendered fat swirled around the institution's grim Gothic spires. Tonight, another incident. A new patient, a young woman named Elara Vance, had arrived, her case file thick with cryptic notations from rural practitioners baffled by her condition. They called it melancholia sanguinis, a term so archaic it made Finch wince. He preferred acute psychological distress, manifesting in physiological anomalies. More scientific, more controllable. Elara's arrival had been disquieting. Her eyes, wide and unnervingly bright, held a depth of despair that went beyond mere madness. She spoke in whispers, fragmented phrases about a thing in the woods, a whispering shadow. Finch, a man of science, dismissed such talk as delusions, a common symptom of severe mental unbalance. Yet the nurses reported strange occurrences around her ward. Flickering lights, sudden drops in temperature, the unsettling sensation of being watched. Dr. Finch, however, was a pragmatist. Electrical anomalies, faulty thermostats, overactive imaginations. The asylum, after all, was old, its systems prone to failure. He reviewed her intake form once more. Age 23. Diagnosis, hysteria, acute delusional psychosis. Previous treatments, sedation, hydrotherapy. Prognosis, guarded. Finch sighed, the sound lost in the ambient hum of the ventilation system. He believed in order, in logic, in the quantifiable. The unpredictable nature of the human mind, however, often defied his neat classifications. He looked to the steel door of his office, then to the locked cabinet where his instruments lay. Restraint, observation, and analysis. That was his creed. He would bring order to Elara Vance and to the strange occurrences plaguing Ward C. The night shift was always the most challenging. The asylum seemed to breathe differently in the darkness, its massive brick structure groaning under the weight of its own history. Nurse Agnes, stoic and unwavering, reported directly to Dr. Finch, her face etched with fatigue. Patient Vance is agitated, Doctor. She's been speaking to the walls again. Says she can hear the gears turning in them. Finch nodded, making a note. Auditory hallucinations expected. Any other anomalies, nurse? He inquired, his tone flat. Agnes hesitated. The ventilation shaft in her room, Doctor. It seems to pulse, as if something is moving behind it. Finch raised an eyebrow. Nonsense, nurse. Merely the normal operation of the mechanical air circulation system. Perhaps a loose damper. I'll have the maintenance crew inspect it in the morning. As documented in the Journal of Industrial Medicine, Volume 14, 1903, the psychological impact of isolated low-frequency oscillations, often originating from industrial machinery or ventilation systems, can induce profound disturbances in susceptible individuals, frequently misinterpreted as supernatural phenomena. Finch often quoted such texts, using them as shields against the unsettling whispers of the unknown. He believed that every thermal anomaly could be explained by a faulty heating coil, every pressure release by a failing steam pipe. There was always a logical explanation, a mechanistic fault, a systemic breakdown. He made his rounds, the flickering gas lamps casting long dancing shadows on the polished linoleum floors. The air grew colder as he approached Ward C, a chill that seemed to seep into his very bones. Elara's door was slightly ajar, a violation of protocol. He pushed it open slowly, revealing the patient huddled in the corner of her room, eyes fixed on the ventilation grate high on the wall. Patient Vance, he stated, his voice calm and authoritative. Why are you out of bed? She didn't respond, merely pointed a trembling finger at the grate. It's watching me, Doctor. The industrial anomaly. It feels operationally integrated. Finch followed her gaze. The grate was normal, bolted securely to the wall. Yet he fancied he could hear a faint, rhythmic clicking sound emanating from behind it, like tiny, intricate clockwork. He knelt, pressing his ear to the wall. The sound was undeniable, subtle but persistent. Merely the normal functioning of the air circulation system, Patient Vance, he explained, forcing a reassuring tone into his voice. The institution's internal mechanisms can produce various mechanical reverberations, especially in older structures. But even as he spoke, a tremor of unease prickled at the back of his neck. This was different from a loose damper. This was rhythmic, purposeful. Pittsburgh Press, March 15, 1897. Factory incident claims 2. At the Allegheny Steel Mill, an unforeseen mechanical failure within the central ventilation system resulted in a catastrophic system-wide pressure release, tragically compromising 2 maintenance engineers. Investigations are ongoing, focusing on structural integrity and employee safety protocols. Finch had read that article years ago, a grim reminder of the dangers of advanced machinery. The asylum, with its own labyrinthine network of pipes and vents, was a machine in itself, and like all machines, it could break down. He ordered Nurse Agnes to increase Ilara's sedative dosage. "She's developing paranoid delusions centered on the mechanical infrastructure," he instructed. "A common manifestation of acute systemic dread. We need to stabilize her." Agnes nodded, her expression unreadable. She had seen many patients come and go, many strange things in the asylum's oppressive walls. But even she admitted the clicking behind the vent was unsettling. "It sounds like a heart, Doctor," she'd whispered to him. Finch had dismissed it as a fanciful projection. Industrial Safety Memorandum 47B, regarding steam pressure protocols, all critical pressure vessels to be inspected biannually. Failure to adhere to these guidelines may result in catastrophic operational failures and severe personnel injury. Finch had mandated strict adherence to such bulletins since arriving at the asylum, trying to modernize its ancient systems. He believed that safety protocols were the only bulwark against the terrifying unpredictability of industrial environments. Over the next few days, Ilara's condition deteriorated. The clicking grew louder, more insistent, even to Finch's ears. Other patients began to complain. Vague reports of whispers in the walls, of feeling watched by the pipes. Finch attributed it to mass hysteria, a contagious form of psychological mirroring. He called for a complete inspection of the ventilation system, suspecting a structural defect, a resonant frequency causing a collective delusion. The maintenance crew found nothing amiss. "Clean as a whistle, Doctor," the grizzled foreman reported. "Just the regular operational hum." But the normal operational hum was no longer normal. It had taken on a new cadence, a subtle underlying pulse. Finch noticed that the colder Ilara's room became, the louder the clicking. He began to suspect a thermal anomaly within the system, perhaps a gas leak, or an electrical short causing fluctuations in temperature and sound. He had heard of such things. Industrial environments were ripe for such occurrences. The systematic breakdown of a massive structure. He decided on a more direct form of intervention. Early one morning, armed with his medical bag and a sense of grim determination, he entered Ilara's room. She was curled in a fetal position, shivering, her eyes wide with terror. "It's coming for me, Doctor," she chattered, her teeth rattling. "The industrial anomaly. It wants to integrate me." Finch, hardened by years of treating delusionals, simply administered a stronger sedative. As the drug began to take effect, her struggles lessened, her body growing slack. It was then that he heard it. Unmistakable now, a low guttural murmur emanating from the ventilation shaft. It was not a mechanical sound. It was biological. Finch felt a cold sweat break out on his brow. He approached the vent, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He unbolted the grate, revealing a dark, cavernous space, and peering out from the depths, 2 glowing red eyes, impossibly large, impossibly ancient. A rank metallic odor filled the air, acrid and sickening. Not a thermal anomaly, not a systemic breakdown, something else entirely. A low growl rumbled from the darkness, a sound that vibrated through Finch's very skeleton. He stumbled back, dropping his medical bag with a clatter. This was an unprecedented operational malfunction. a profound systemic aberrance he had never encountered in his years of rigorous scientific study. The thing in the vent was not a figment of a disturbed mind. It was a tangible, horrifying reality, and it was moving. He watched, mesmerized, as a dark, segmented limb dripping with viscous iron residue emerged from the vent, followed by another, then a third. The creature was vast, larger than he could have imagined possible for such a confined space. Its body seemed to be a grotesque amalgamation of wires, pipes, and something organic, pulsing with an inner terrible light. It wasn't an industrial anomaly of law, but an industrial anomaly, a nightmare born of the very machinery that ran the asylum. The creature's grotesque maw, a series of rotating gears and tearing metallic teeth, opened, emitting a high-pitched whine that was not a pressure release, but a sound of pure, unadulterated hunger. Finch could only stand there, frozen, his scientific training useless in the face of such a terrifying, visceral truth. The asylum, his bastion of order and logic, was harboring an impossible horror, a systemic aberrance intertwined with its very infrastructure. Pittsburgh Press, November 2, 1910. Asylum malfunction claims Dr. Alistair Finch, head physician at Blackwood Asylum, was tragically lost in a critical operational failure within the institution's ventilation system. The structural integrity of the wing has been compromised, and a full investigation is underway to determine the cause of the catastrophic event. The newspaper article would be a masterpiece of understatement, Finch knew. It wouldn't mention the industrial anomaly, the creature born of metal and flesh, now operationally integrated with the building itself. He saw Nurse Agnes, her face contorted in a silent pressure release, rushing down the corridor, drawn by the horrific sounds emanating from Ilara's room. She was carrying a heavy iron bar, a desperate, futile weapon against the unquantifiable terror. "Stay back, nurse!" Finch exclaimed, his voice hoarse, but it was too late. The creature was fully out of the vent now, its monstrous form filling the small room, its red eyes fixed on Agnes. As documented in the Journal of Industrial Medicine, Volume 18, 1911, exposure to extreme and unquantifiable environmental stresses, particularly those involving massive structural deformation and the unexpected manifestation of a biological entity not compatible with known taxonomic classifications, can induce acute systemic shock and often results in immediate physiological shutdown. Finch felt his heart surge, then seize as his own system began to fail. The final image burned into his retinas was not of Agnes's face nor of the creature, but of Ilara Vance, still figure in her bed, her eyes now wide open, staring impassively at the unfolding horror. She was no longer frightened. There was a strange, serene understanding in her gaze, as if she had always known, always seen what lay beneath the asylum's veneer of order. She was operationally integrated, and Finch, the man of science, was now merely another component in the asylum's vast, horrific machinery, awaiting his own systemic breakdown. The hum of the ventilation system continued, an ominous lullaby as the industrial anomaly tightened its grip on its new domain. The clang of the mill echoed, a relentless rhythm grinding against the foreman's sanity. Each shift brought new injuries, new faces hollowed by the ceaseless work. Young Timmy, barely old enough to shave, stumbled through the shadows of the colossal machines, his eyes wide with a fear that transcended the normal dread of industrial accidents. He whispered of whispers, of cold spots, of a distinct mechanical hum that no engineer could account for. "It's the mill, lad," Foreman O'Malley would gruffly reply, his voice thick with years of dust and resigned weariness. "She's an old beast, got her own noises." But even O'Malley, a man whose spine was as iron as the girders above, felt a prickling unease. Some nights after the last worker had shuffled out, he swore he heard the distant metallic shriek, like a gear grinding where no gear should be, followed by a pressure release that was far too human. The incidents began subtly. Tools misplaced, safety levers mysteriously disengaged. Then, more gravely, small fires erupting from seemingly inert machinery. The company directors, insulated in their opulent offices downtown, dismissed these as typical operational hazards, emphasizing increased production quotas. Yet the workers knew better. They spoke in hushed tones of the mill spirit, a malevolent force born of iron and steam that sought to claim its due. Timmy, however, saw not a spirit, but a design flaw, a systemic corruption within the very heart of the factory. He saw the cold, calculating eyes of profit over human life, manifesting as a kind of industrial anomaly. One blustery October evening, the sky bruised purple and grey, the mill was pushing its limits. The night shift droned on, punctuated by the rhythmic thud and hiss of the colossal presses. Timmy, tasked with monitoring the main pressure valves, swore he saw a shadow detach itself from the wall, a wavering outline that seemed to ripple like heat haze. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, passing through solid machinery as if it were vapor. Panic seized him, not a personal fear, but a surge of systemic dread, a cold certainty that the system itself was about to fail. "It's operationally integrated," he later stammered to O'Malley, his voice barely a whisper, describing the shadow's peculiar movement around a crucial conveyor belt. O'Malley, ever pragmatic, checked the belt, finding nothing amiss. But an hour later, the belt jammed, an unprecedented failure that brought production to a grinding halt. A young laborer, caught in the sudden stoppage, suffered a broken arm. Officially, it was an accident. Unofficially, the whispers intensified. The atmosphere in the mill grew thicker, heavy with an unseen presence. Workers became jumpy, their eyes darting into the industrial shadows, convinced the mill was mechanically compromised. Productivity sagged, not due to laziness, but due to a palpable, pervasive anxiety. The directors dispatched a team of efficiency experts, slick-haired men in suits who took copious notes, but offered no solutions, only further demands for output. Their report spoke of morale deficiencies and superstitious tendencies manifesting as decreased throughput. One night, the central steam piston, a behemoth of polished steel, began to throb with an unnatural rhythm, a low, guttural pulse that vibrated through the very foundations of the mill. The engineers, highly trained and rational men, scoured schematics, checked pressure gauges, and inspected every rivet. They found nothing. Timmy, however, insisted he saw a thermal anomaly hovering near the piston, a shimmering heat haze that pulsed in time with the unnatural thrum. "It's an industrial anomaly," he repeated, pointing with a trembling finger, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and peculiar insight. As documented in the Journal of Industrial Medicine, Volume 14, 1903, persistent exposure to high-decibel industrial noise and the rapid fluctuation of thermal environments can induce visual distortions and auditory hallucinations in susceptible individuals, leading to heightened anxiety and a perceived presence of external stimuli, often misinterpreted as malevolent entities. The entry, tucked into an old medical journal O'Malley found in the company's small, dusty medical office, offered little comfort. He knew what the journal said, but he also knew the fear in his men's eyes was real. Then came the tragedy. Old Man Hemlock, a fixture of the forge for 30 years, was found crushed beneath a collapsed crane. Pittsburgh Press, June 21, 1908. Mill accident claims veteran worker. Negligence suspected after crane failure. Investigation launched. The newspaper headline, stark and uncompromising, blamed faulty maintenance, but witnesses spoke of the crane operating without its engine engaged, of a sudden inexplicable lurch, as if an unseen hand had manipulated the controls. The official report cited metal fatigue, but the sense of systemic dread among the workers deepened. They whispered of a systemically aberrant force, an intelligent malevolence that operated within the mill's very mechanisms. Timmy, his youthful optimism eroded, became a grim prophet. He spoke less of thermal anomalies and more of operational integrations, of systemic aberrations that were not supernatural but rather malevolent manifestations of the factory's own dark soul. He started sketching diagrams, not of spirits but of stress points, of peculiar energy fluctuations, of cold, hard data he couldn't quite explain but clearly observed. His eyes, once wide with innocent terror, now held a focused, almost clinical horror. He was starting to apply scientific principles to the inexplicable. Industrial Safety Memorandum 47B. Regarding steam pressure protocols, all personnel are reminded that unauthorized tampering with pressure valves, even for perceived safety enhancements, is strictly prohibited due to critical system dependencies. Adherence to established procedure is paramount for operational stability and accident prevention. This bulletin, posted grimly on the main board after Hemlock's death, felt like a hollow mockery. The workers felt a different kind of pressure, an unseen force attempting to manipulate their very environment. The thermal anomaly, as Timmy called it, grew bolder. It began to appear in clearer forms, a shimmering, distorted figure that moved with an efficient mechanical grace. It seemed to patrol the factory floor, observing, calculating. Workers described it as a still figure when it paused, an absence of heat, a strange, perfect stillness that mimicked a discarded uniform. Some swore they heard the low metallic hum, the same that Timmy had heard, emanating from its very core. It was not a ghost. It was too precise, too industrial. It was an anomaly of the machine, a malevolent process. The air in the mill grew colder, despite the roaring furnaces. Production faltered further. There were moments when all the machines seemed to shudder in unison, a low collective groan that was not mechanical. Then all would stop, the terrifying silence broken only by the hard, rapid breathing of the men. Management dispatched another team, this time a psychologist and an engineer. The psychologist spoke of mass hysteria, the engineer of harmonic resonance. Neither had satisfactory answers. More incidents followed. A boiler inexplicably overpressurized, causing a pressure release that deafened a watchman. Pittsburgh Press, October 3rd, 1910. Boiler explosion injures mill worker. The report highlighted the watchman's survival, but detailed the traumatic injury. The pressure release, they wrote, was due to a faulty safety valve. But the watchman, once he recovered his hearing, swore he saw the thermal anomaly near the valve, its shimmering form manipulating the controls. He described it as a silent, efficient industrial anomaly, a being made of pure process. Foreman O'Malley, a man who believed in sweat and steel, not spirits, found himself questioning everything. He saw the systematic breakdown, the inexplicable failures, the increasing toll it took on his men. He looked at the historical inserts Timmy had dug up, reports of similar incidents in other factories, dismissed as worker error or equipment failure, and saw a pattern of calculated systemic dread. He began to believe Timmy's thermal anomaly was not a hallucination, but a physical distortion, an energy fluctuation, a genuine operationally integrated element of the mill itself, something created by the mill's abyssal conditions. The mill wasn't just mechanically compromised, it was malevolent. It wasn't simply old, it was corrupted. The iron residue that stained the floors, once dismissed as mere industrial waste, now seemed to possess a deeper, more sinister meaning. It was the mark of the industrial anomaly, the physical consequence of its systemic aberrations. One evening, as heavy rain hammered against the corrugated iron roof, the main power coupling began to spark uncontrollably. Timmy, having developed a strange, almost symbiotic relationship with the mill's dark heart, sensed it wasn't an electrical malfunction. He saw the thermal anomaly, more defined now, a skeletal flickering form writhing around the coupling, drawing power, growing stronger. He felt not a personal fear, but a surge of pure, raw systemic dread, a cold certainty that the mill was completing its operational integration. Industrial Safety Bulletin, Form 21C, March 1911. All personnel are reminded that unsupervised contact with high-voltage machinery is strictly prohibited. The protocols for power isolation must be rigorously adhered to, and all reported electrical anomalies are to be addressed by trained electrical engineers only. Disregard for these procedures jeopardizes operational integrity and worker safety. This recent bulletin, tacked up with fresh tacks, felt ironic, almost as if it had been put up by the mill itself to mock their helplessness. Timmy, ignoring the bulletin, ignored the shouts of the other workers. He watched transfixed as the industrial anomaly seemed to coalesce, its shimmering form becoming denser, more defined, like a living shadow forged from heat and iron. It was no longer a thermal anomaly, but a truly systemically aberrant entity, a mechanical consciousness that had been slowly, relentlessly, operationally integrating itself into the mill's very framework. It fed on the fear, on the despair, on the inevitable friction and failure of the system. The core of the mill, the vast central engine that drove all the machines, began to hum, a deep, resonant tone that vibrated through the very bones of the building. The sound was not of a machine running smoothly. It was a sound of profound pain and power, of something awakening. The thermal anomaly retreated into the engine, and the hum intensified. Timmy watched, feeling the systemic dread turn into a cold scientific curiosity. The mill, his mill, was no longer just a place of work. It was a single, breathing, malevolent entity, an industrial anomaly that had achieved full operational integration. The men were not just workers, they were components, their lives the iron residue upon which the system ran. The clang of the mill, once a rhythm of labor, was now a heartbeat strong and terrifying. And Timmy knew with a horrible clarity that the factory would never truly be silent again. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to his core that he was merely a cog in a machine that now had a dreadful, malevolent will of its own. It was a horror transcending simple fear. It was the ultimate cold, inescapable reality of systemic dread. The flickering gaslight cast long dancing shadows across the grim, unyielding walls of the asylum's lower ward. Dr. Alistair Finch, his spectacles perched precariously on his nose, meticulously documented the case of patient 7B, a man whose decline had been as swift as it was inexplicable. The facility, a sprawling monolithic structure of blackened brick and cold iron, hummed with a low mechanical thrum that seemed to penetrate the very bones. Outside, the perpetual drizzle of an industrial city clung to the window panes like a shroud, obscuring the grimy rooftops and belching smokestacks. The air was thick with the scent of disinfectant, damp stone, and an undercurrent of something metallic, something almost mineral. Patient 7B, a former loom operator from the textile mills, now lay inert on his cot, his eyes wide and unseeing, fixed on some unseen point in the distant ceiling. His history, meticulously recorded in the heavy leather-bound ledger, detailed months of progressively worsening disorientation, culminating in a complete cessation of voluntary motor functions. The man would occasionally emit a low guttural moan, a sound Dr. Finch had initially attributed to a pressure release, but which had since become more disturbing in its mechanical regularity. Other patients spoke of a subtle coldness, a peculiar drop in temperature that accompanied 7B's increasingly erratic episodes. But Finch had dismissed these as mere anecdotal observations, the product of overactive and compromised minds. As documented in the Journal of Industrial Medicine, Volume 14, 1903, the progressive neural deterioration observed in operatives exposed to prolonged vibration and airborne particulate matter presents a complex challenge to occupational health protocols. Dr. Finch murmured, reviewing his notes. This particular ward, built below ground level, was perpetually chilled. A design flaw of the original architect, or perhaps a cruel irony for the patients who languished within its confines. The sounds of the institutional machinery, the distant clanking of pipes, the rhythmic chug of the asylum's rudimentary ventilation system, provided a ceaseless, oppressive soundtrack to the daily routine. The ward attendant, a gaunt man named Miller, approached Finch, his footsteps echoing on the stone floor. "Doctor, patient 7B's parameters are unsettling. The internal regulator readings fluctuate wildly, and his systemic pressure release episodes are becoming more frequent." Finch nodded, making a note in his ledger. "Indeed, Miller. The systemic dread of the unknown operates with considerable force in these cases. We must continue to monitor output. Are there any other disturbances reported?" Miller hesitated, glancing around the dimly lit ward. "Only the observations from patient 4A, Doctor. He insists on a recurring thermal anomaly near 7B's cot, a drop in ambient temperature he describes as glacial. He also claims to perceive a distinct hum, not unlike a high-tension cable under load." Finch sighed. Patient 4A was a retired machinist, prone to elaborate technical delusions. His perceptions are undoubtedly a manifestation of his own institutionalized condition. Log the thermal readings nonetheless. No detail is too insignificant for thorough documentation. The following night, a profound sense of unease descended upon the lower ward. The gaslights flickered with greater intensity, their flames struggling against an invisible current. The metallic tang in the air grew stronger, almost tangible. Miller, conducting his rounds, noted a precipitous drop in the ward's ambient temperature that defied explanation. His breath plumed in the cold air as he approached patient 7B's cot. From the Pittsburgh Press, March 15, 1897, Factory. Incident claims 2. A catastrophic failure of a main boiler valve at the Consolidated Steel Foundry on Elm Street resulted in the instantaneous incapacitation of 2 operatives, Mr. Thomas O'Malley and Mr. Arthur Jenkins. Investigations are underway to determine adherence to safety protocols. Early reports suggest internal structural fatigue. This snippet, discovered by Finch later, resonated with an uncanny resonance. The descriptions of instantaneous incapacitation and internal structural fatigue seemed disturbingly apt for 7B's condition, as if the very machinery of the world had malfunctioned within him. Miller knelt beside 7B, checking his pulse. The still figure was rigid, cold to the touch. Suddenly a low hum filled the air, emanating from 7B's very being. A sound that vibrated through the floorboards and up into Miller's spine. A series of rapid clicks began, like a malfunctioning mechanism inside his chest. Then a pressure release, sharper and more violent than any before, tore from 7B's throat. A sound of pure mechanical anguish that echoed through the ward, causing other patients to stir in their sleep. Finch rushed in, drawn by the commotion. He found Miller backing away from 7B's cot, his face pale. "Doctor, it's—" "He's emitting a noise, like a bearing seizing." Finch, though unnerved, maintained his composure. "A systemic breakdown, Miller. Observe and record all output indicators." He pulled out his stethoscope, placing it against 7B's chest. Beneath the cold skin, he could hear a distinct rhythmic grinding as if internal gears were stripping. The air around 7B felt electric, charged. Industrial Safety Memorandum 47B, regarding steam pressure protocols in confined environments. All pressure gauges to be inspected bi-hourly. Overpressure events carry a high risk of catastrophic structural deformity and operational failure, Finch recalled, another relevant piece of archived data surfacing in his mind. The feeling of systemic dread intensified. Over the next few days, the thermal anomaly surrounding patient 7B became undeniable. Thermometers placed near his cot registered temperatures far below the ward average. Other patients, their minds already fragile, began to display signs of accelerated decline, whispering of a cold presence, a chilling draft from nowhere. The asylum, typically a bastion of ordered suffering, began to feel operationally integrated into something far older and less comprehensible. The very air seemed to thicken with a pervasive sense of systemic aberration. From the Pittsburgh Press, May 22, 1905, Mill accident claims another. Mr. Robert Thorne, a foreman at the Carnegie Steel Works, suffered a profound mental collapse following exposure to a rapidly fragmenting flywheel. Witnesses reported an unnatural disfigurement of the machinery prior to the incident, causing widespread alarm among the workforce. The newspaper's words painted a chilling picture of an industrial anomaly, a defect within the system itself that defied conventional explanation. Finch, despite his scientific training, found himself increasingly unnerved. The persistent metallic scent, the unexplained temperature drops, the mechanical pressure releases from 7B, they all coalesced into a disturbing pattern. He began to pore over the asylum's original blueprints, searching for any hidden conduits, any forgotten ventilation shafts that might explain the anomalies. One evening, during a particularly violent thunderstorm, the asylum's antiquated electrical system faltered, plunging the lower ward into near-total darkness. Only a single sputtering gas lamp remained lit, casting grotesque shadows. Amidst the sudden gloom, a high-pitched whining sound began to emanate from patient 7B's cot, growing in intensity. It was a sound of immense friction, of something being forcibly torn apart. Miller, clutching a lantern, arrived, his eyes wide with fear. "Doctor, the still figure, it's shifting." Finch approached cautiously. In the dim light, he saw 7B's body, rigid for so long, now convulsing with violent mechanical tremors. A distinct grinding sound filled the air, accompanied by the smell of ozone and hot metal. A thin, dark liquid, not unlike iron residue, began to seep from the corners of 7B's mouth, dribbling down his chin. As documented in the Journal of Industrial Medicine, Volume 21, 1911, advanced stages of particulate inhalation may manifest as internal hemorrhaging, often presenting with fluid discharge and systemic organ failure. Prognosis for recovery is universally grave, necessitating immediate isolation and extensive post-mortem analysis for epidemiological purposes, Finch recited, a desperate attempt to maintain his scientific objectivity in the face of such profound strangeness. The mechanical compromise of patient 7B was becoming increasingly apparent, a terrifying symphony of systemic breakdown. The whining escalated to a deafening shriek, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. The gas lamp flickered violently, then extinguished, plunging the ward into absolute darkness. From the Pittsburgh Press, August 8, 1910. Boiler explosion rocks East Liberty. A deafening roar and subsequent structural collapse at the Commonwealth manufacturing plant resulted in multiple fatalities. Authorities are investigating the possibility of deliberate sabotage, citing unusual vibrational patterns reported by employees in the preceding weeks. This final report, though dated later, still echoed the chilling narrative, the suggestion of an inherent destructive force from within. When the emergency generators finally whirred to life, bathing the ward in a stark electric light, Miller and Finch stood frozen. Patient 7B lay still once more, but his form was subtly altered. His features, though still human, now possessed a peculiar, almost metallic sheen. His eyes, once unseeing, now seemed to hold a cold, intelligent gleam, a reflection of the industrial anomaly that had fully operationally integrated him. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the pungent, unmistakable odor of fresh iron residue. Finch, his hands trembling, closed his ledger. His scientific mind, once so certain, now reeled. He had documented not a man's decline, but a terrifying transformation, a systemic subversion. The once human patient 7B had become an instrument, a vessel for a chilling mechanical force that mirrored the relentless, consuming machinery of the industrial world outside. The asylum, initially a place of healing, now functioned as a silent, unheeded warning, a crucible for the terrifying fusion of man and machine, a testament to the systemically aberrant forces lurking beneath the veneer of progress. The pervasive, institutionalized dread permeated every stone, every whisper of the wind, a chilling premonition of a future where humanity itself might become just another cog in an incomprehensible, terrifying mechanism. The still figure was no longer merely a patient. It was a phenomenon, a chilling testament to the cold, unfeeling processes of an indifferent industrial universe. The final entry in Finch's ledger remained chillingly blank, for how does one document the erasure of a soul, replaced by the relentless, grinding hum of a machine? There were no words, only the cold, unyielding reality of the mechanically compromised. The stench of iron residue hung heavy in the air, a metallic tang that seemed to cling to the very fabric of the old mill. Elias, his overalls stiff with grime, wiped a gloved hand across his brow, leaving a streak of grease. The hum of the machinery was a constant, mind-numbing drone, a systemic symphony of industry that had swallowed countless men whole. Tonight, however, there was a disquieting dissonance, a rhythmic clanking from deep within the abandoned section of the plant that prickled the hairs on his neck. He'd heard the whispers, of course, the hushed reports from the night shift about a thermal anomaly, a lingering chill that no amount of boiler pressure could dispel. Locals called it mechanically compromised, attributing the disturbances to a miner who had years ago been operationally integrated into the very gears of the colossal stamping press. The foreman, a gruff man named Henderson, had dismissed it all as fatigue, a collective hallucination brought on by the grueling shifts and poor ventilation. "Lads, you're letting your imaginations run wild," he'd bellowed, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. "It's just the old pipes settling, nothing more." But Elias knew better. He'd seen the fear in the eyes of his fellow workers, a systemic dread that was far more potent than any casual superstition. The mill had a way of draining you, not just of your strength, but of your very will, leaving behind an empty shell, prone to irrational fears. The air was thick with the dust of ages, a fine, almost invisible powder that coated everything, giving the industrial behemoth a spectral pallor under the flickering gaslights. He remembered the recent incident, a particularly gruesome one that had been swiftly filed away as unfortunate equipment malfunction. The data sheet read, "Worker X suffered catastrophic bodily trauma due to unexpected mechanical recalibration. Cause unknown systemic anomaly." Elias had seen the still figure, an unrecognizable mass of twisted metal and raw material, and the sight had burned itself into his memory. The official report from the Occupational Health and Safety Committee, dated September 17, 1908, stated, "All safety protocols observed. System deemed compliant. No actionable fault identified." Yet the machine had continued to operate, a silent testament to the disregard for human life that permeated the factory. Tonight the clanking was louder, more deliberate. It wasn't the rhythmic thrum of the pistons, nor the groan of the gears. It was a distinctive, uneven beat, like something struggling, or attempting to communicate through the sheer force of its desperation. Elias felt a cold sweat trickle down his spine. He knew he should report it, but to whom? Henderson would only scoff, or worse, dock his pay for insubordination. The system was designed to absorb such irregularities, to classify them as minor aberrations quickly rectified, or more often ignored, until they erupted into catastrophic system failures. He decided to investigate himself, armed with a dim lantern and a wrench he kept holstered on his belt. The flickering light cast dancing shadows on the grimy walls, making the already grotesque machinery seem even more monstrous. The deeper he ventured into the abandoned section, the colder it became, an unnatural chill that seemed to emanate directly from the metallic floor. The clanking grew more insistent, and with it a faint, high-pitched whine. He thought of the outdated medical journals in the foreman's office, filled with descriptions of hysteria and neurasthenia, diseases of the mind brought on by the relentless pressures of industrial life. He could almost hear Dr. Arthur W. Peterson's 1905 paper, The Psychological Deterioration of the Urban Laborer, detailing the prevalence of auditory hallucinations in those subjected to prolonged periods of intense noise and fatigue. Passing by a rusted-out boiler, he noticed a peculiar condensation, not steam, but a slick, viscous residue that coated the pipes. It smelled faintly of ozone and something else, something acrid and metallic. It was then he saw it, a flicker of movement within the shadows cast by a colossal turbine. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The clanking stopped. An oppressive silence descended, broken only by the rapid thumping of his own heart. A pressure release ripped through the air, a sound of pure anguish that seemed devoid of human origin. It was mechanical, high-pitched like overworked steam pipes exploding. He gripped the wrench tighter, his knuckles white. "Hello?" he called out, his voice a reedy whisper in the vast, echoing space. No answer. Only the return of the rhythmic, uneven clanking, closer now, accompanied by a low, guttural grinding. It felt as if the entire structure was groaning, a subterranean groan of metal and concrete, under some unseen, immense strain. He shone his lantern toward the turbine, its grimy blades shrouded in perpetual twilight. And then he saw it. A still figure, half obscured by the machinery, dark and indistinct. It was too tall, too gaunt, its limbs contorted at impossible angles. It was operationally integrated into the very structure of the turbine, its metallic eyes fixed on Elias. His mind raced, desperately searching for a rational explanation. A trick of the light, a pile of discarded rags, anything but what his eyes were telling him. But the still figure shifted, its metallic joints groaning, and began to move slowly, deliberately toward him. The clanking intensified, a deafening cacophony of screeching metal and grinding gears. The pressure release, now closer, was a sustained, piercing shriek. It was not human. It was something else, something forged in the heart of the mill, born of its relentless efficiency and its utter disregard for those it consumed. A memory surfaced unbidden. The Pittsburgh Press, October 22, 1903, had reported, "Factory worker fatally crushed. Mr. Thomas Miller met a tragic end today at the Allegheny Steel Works, becoming entangled in the primary cogworks. Officials cite a regrettable lapse in safety adherence. No mechanical fault found." Elias knew then that the mill harbored more than just industrial accidents. It cultivated systemically aberrant events, feeding on the toil and fear of its human components. The still figure was an embodiment of this. He stumbled backward, fear a cold knot in his stomach. The air grew frigid, and the stench of ozone intensified, making his eyes water. The figure pursued him, its movements jerky and unnatural, each step accompanied by a chilling metallic scrape against the concrete floor. He could almost hear the whispers of the other workers, their warnings of a thermal anomaly, now chillingly real. It was an industrial anomaly, a mechanical aberration that had taken root in the heart of the factory, feeding on the residue of human suffering. He fled, scrambling over discarded machinery, his breath ragged in his lungs. The pressure release grew louder, a sound of pure mechanical agony that seemed to tear at the very fabric of his being. He could feel the systemic dread clawing at him, an existential terror that transcended simple fear. This wasn't a personal attack. It was a systemic breakdown, an institutional failure that manifested as a monstrous, animated part of the mill itself. It was the mill in its relentless, crushing efficiency come to claim another. He burst out of the abandoned section, gasping for breath. The familiar hum of the functioning machinery suddenly a welcome sound. He leaned against a cold steel beam, his legs trembling. The foreman found him there minutes later, pale and shaking. "Elias, what in tarnation is wrong with you?" Henderson demanded, his voice gruff. "You look like you've seen a still figure." Elias could only shake his head, unable to articulate the horrors he had witnessed. How could he explain an industrial anomaly that defied all logic, a systemic breakdown that had manifested as a spectral machine? He knew Henderson would dismiss it as worker exhaustion, a common diagnosis in the factory's rudimentary medical log. As documented in the Journal of Industrial Medicine, volume 14, 1903, psychogenic manifestations, including oral hallucinations, are prevalent among factory laborers, misattributed to apparitions. Later, as the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting long, weak shadows across the mill floor, Elias saw Henderson talking to a new recruit, a young man with wide, eager eyes. Henderson clapped him on the shoulder, a forced smile on his face. Elias watched, a cold certainty settling in his gut. The mill would continue its relentless churn, consuming lives, generating its own unique brand of trauma. The still figures would persist within its bowels, a testament to the systemically aberrant processes at play. The clanking, he knew, would never truly stop. It was a part of the mill now, an integral, operationally integrated component of its terrifying efficiency. The pressure releases would continue to echo through the empty spaces, a mournful lament of the industrial anomaly that lurked within. He recalled Industrial Safety Memorandum 47-B, regarding steam pressure protocols and the psychological effects of machinery, 1910, emphasizing the potential for auditory phenomena. Another, later bulletin, Special Directive 6B, from the State Bureau of Labor, 1912, detailed unaccounted for disappearances within factory facilities, protocol for internal inquiry, and public information management. Elias felt a profound weariness, a systemic dread that was far deeper than simple fatigue. He was trapped, like so many others, in the unyielding gears of the industrial machine. And as the new recruit began his shift, the metallic tang of iron residue once again filled the air, a chilling reminder of the mill's insatiable hunger for human flesh and spirit. The still figure, he knew, was waiting, always waiting, and the mill would continue its systemic path, crushing all in its wake. The industrial anomaly would persist, a haunting echo of forgotten suffering. The flickering gas lamp cast long, dancing shadows across the grim, unpainted walls of the old mill. A chill permeated the structure, seeping into Arthur's bones, a coldness that had nothing to do with the winter night pressing against the grimy windows. His breath plumed in the stagnant air, each exhale a small white cloud of despair. The pervasive rumble and clatter of the machinery, even at this late hour, seemed to echo the frantic thumping in his chest. He clutched the faded photograph in his trembling hand, the smiling face of his deceased wife, mocking his current torment. She had always told him that this place, this monstrous engine of industry, would one day consume them all. He now understood the chilling truth of her prophecy. Arthur was the night shift foreman, a position he had held for almost 2 decades, guiding the younger, less experienced hands, ensuring the relentless gears and pulleys continued their ceaseless, deafening work. But lately the mill had become different, subtly, ominously altered. The rhythmic thrumming of the machines had taken on a discordant note, a low, guttural moan that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the building. Tools would inexplicably vanish from their assigned racks, only to reappear in impossible locations, half buried in coal dust in a remote corner of the boiler room, or tangled within the complex mechanisms of a textile loom, narrowly avoiding a catastrophic breakdown. The men, hardened by years of brutal labor, whispered of a presence, a malevolent force, a thermal anomaly, they called it, that stalked the dimly lit corridors, its unseen hand brushing against their necks, chilling them to the marrow. "It ain't right, foreman," young Thomas had muttered just the night before, his eyes wide with an unspeakable dread. "They say old man McGregor, who fell into the cogworks last year, he's still here. His spirit, it ain't moved on." Arthur had scoffed then, dismissing it as the superstitious ramblings of an overtired laborer, another casualty of the long hours and oppressive atmosphere. He had reminded Thomas of the industrial safety bulletins displayed prominently near the workshop entrance, which clearly outlined the protocols for avoiding such incidents, emphasizing individual responsibility and adherence to established guidelines. However, as the weeks bled into months, even Arthur, a man of rigid logic and steadfast resolve, began to question his own certainties. The incidents grew more frequent, more unsettling. The pressure releases from the steam pipes became an almost constant occurrence, high-pitched wails that sliced through the mill's din, echoing with a strangely human quality. One particularly grueling Tuesday, an entire section of the main conveyor belt inexplicably reversed direction, sending hundreds of pounds of raw material tumbling onto the factory floor, narrowly missing a group of workers. The men scrambled, their faces etched with a mixture of terror and bewilderment. Arthur, inspecting the damaged machinery, found no discernible mechanical fault, no broken gears or frayed belts. It was as if some unseen hand had deliberately tampered with the controls. He remembered then the words from the Pittsburgh Press, March 15, 1897. Factory incident claims 2. He felt a cold dread seep into his soul, a systemic dread that went beyond personal fear. The mill, this titan of industry, was becoming operationally integrated with something else, something fundamentally aberrant. The foreman's office, a cramped, stuffy room tucked away behind the roaring engine room, offered little respite. The walls, stained with decades of coal dust and grease, seemed to absorb all light and hope. He often sat there, hunched over his battered desk, poring over requisition forms and production reports, trying to find a logical explanation for the mounting anomalies. He considered the possibilities, dismissing each in turn. Structural fatigue? No, the mill was built to last, a testament to Victorian engineering. Sabotage? Unlikely, no one had any reason. A pervasive sense of dread, like a poisonous gas, filled the room, making it difficult to breathe. The air was thick with the smell of scorched metal, and something else, something metallic and cloying, like drying iron residue. The night he discovered old Silas, a veteran boiler operator, was when Arthur's carefully constructed world truly began to unravel. Silas, a man known for his meticulous adherence to safety protocols set forth in Industrial Safety Memorandum 47B regarding steam pressure protocols, was found slumped against a cold boiler, his face a mask of frozen terror. There were no visible injuries, no signs of a struggle. His eyes, wide and staring, seemed to gaze upon something beyond mortal comprehension. A fine mist of reddish-brown droplets, a metallic iron residue, coated the surrounding pipes. The medical examiner, a brusque young doctor fresh out of medical school, recorded the cause of death as cardiac arrest. But Arthur knew better. As documented in the Journal of Industrial Medicine, Volume 14, 1903, he had seen the look in Silas's eyes, a look he now recognized in the faces of his remaining crew, a look of pure systemic dread. This facility appears to be manifesting significant operational irregularities, Arthur wrote in his private journal, his hand steady, despite the tremor in his heart. The observed phenomena defy current mechanical and thermodynamic principles. Further investigation into the structural integrity and potential environmental stresses is imperative. He sounded like a man drowning in a sea of bureaucratic jargon, desperately trying to impose order on a world rapidly descending into chaos. Such inexplicable physiological responses in industrial environments warranted comprehensive analysis. The sheer irrationality of the events had begun to wear on him, eroding his logical mind, replacing it with a creeping paranoia. He found himself jumping at every phantom noise, every creak of the old building settling, every pressure release from the pipes. He began to notice subtle shifts in the mill's landscape. Tools that went missing would sometimes reappear in strangely ordered patterns, geometric configurations that held no logical purpose. The flickering gaslight seemed to dim and brighten without cause, sometimes casting strange, elongated shadows that moved with no visible source. The faint smell of ozone, usually associated with electrical discharge, lingered in certain areas, particularly near the massive, dormant dynamos. The men, increasingly agitated, spoke of mechanical apparitions, fleeting glimpses of figures caught in the periphery of their vision, solid and real for a moment, then gone, leaving only a lingering chill. Arthur's heart pounded, a frantic drumbeat against his ribs. He felt the weight of his responsibility, not just for the men, but for the very fabric of reality within these walls. He was observing a breakdown, not just of machinery, but of fundamental order. His nights became a blur of frantic observations and increasingly desperate attempts to document the inexplicable. He purchased a new expensive camera, hoping to capture proof, something tangible, to present to the skeptical mill owners. But the photographs, when developed, always showed mere blurs, streaks of light, or nothing at all, as if the very presence evaded the lens. This operational integration, this mechanical compromise, was defying scientific classification. He felt like a lone sentinel, standing against an encroaching tide of systemic dread. The mill, once a symbol of human ingenuity and progress, was transforming into something else, something alien and terrifying, a living, groaning entity that consumed not just resources, but sanity. The climax of this insidious transformation occurred on a moonless night, the air thick with the acrid smell of coal smoke and impending doom. Arthur was conducting his rounds, a heavy wrench clutched in his hand, his nerves frayed raw. He patrolled the vast factory floor, the rhythmic clang of the machinery, normally a comfort, now a torment. He walked past the main power conduit, a thick artery of the mill's energy, when he saw it. A still figure, a human form, lying prone beside the churning gears of the main textile loom. A wave of ice-cold terror washed over him, a systemic dread that paralyzed his limbs. It was young Thomas. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly upwards, coated in a fine sheen of iron residue. The gruesome scene confirmed Arthur's darkest suspicions. As Arthur knelt beside the still figure, a low guttural growl echoed from the depths of the complex machinery. The gears seemed to slow, then accelerate erratically, their grinding tempo taking on a malevolent rhythm. The air grew heavy, static electricity crackling around him. He felt a presence, an immense unseen force coiling around him, drawing him in. The pressure releases from the steam pipes became incessant, a cacophony of horrific high-pitched wails, each one stripping away another layer of his sanity. He stumbled back, his mind reeling, the world tilting on its axis. He realized then that the mill wasn't just operationally integrated with something aberrant. It was the aberrant thing. This entire industrial marvel, a symbol of human progress, now manifested a chilling internal malice. He managed to stagger back to his office, collapsing into his chair, his heart pounding a frantic tattoo against his ribs. He grabbed his journal, his hand shaking so violently he could barely hold the pen. "The facility is manifesting a full-scale systemic breakdown," he scrawled, the ink smudging as his vision blurred. "Observed physical and psychomotor effects on personnel are irreversible." The primary cause appears to be a large-scale industrial anomaly, exhibiting characteristics beyond current scientific classification. Immediate cessation of all operations and comprehensive dismantling is recommended to prevent further casualties. He knew no one would believe him. They would attribute it to exhaustion, to madness, to anything but the horrifying truth. The mill, this giant of industry, had become mechanically compromised, a monstrous living entity. Its hunger insatiable. He sat there listening to the cacophony of the mill, the groaning gears, the hissing steam, the low resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate in his very bones. He was trapped, a lone individual in a vast indifferent system that had turned on itself, devouring its own. The gas lamp flickered then, its light dimming, plunging the office into near total darkness, leaving only the faintest glow of the moonlight seeping through the begrimed window pane. He looked around the desolate room, the shadows dancing, stretching, twisting into grotesque shapes. He felt a strange calm settle over him, an acceptance of the inevitable. There was no escape. The system had won. The mechanical compromise was complete. The industrial anomaly had claimed another victim. He was just another cog in its monstrous, relentless machinery, his fate sealed by the inherent systemic dread of the mill. The flickering gaslight cast long skeletal shadows across the grimy walls, making the familiar patterns of the abandoned factory floor twist into monstrous visages. Elias shivered, though not from the chill permeating the vast silent space. It was the presence, the cold creeping dread that tightened his chest with a systemic grip, a sensation far more profound than mere chills. He'd heard the whispers, felt the tremors, the subtle operational anomalies that had driven men from these very halls in droves, leaving only the clank and groan of disused machinery to echo in the dark. Tonight, however, the whispers had taken on a new, more insistent quality. like the grinding of gears struggling under an unbearable load. "Just imagination, old man," he muttered, his voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. Yet, his gaze darted towards the hulking silhouette of the massive stamping press, its massive jaws agape, frozen mid-descent. They said it was mechanically compromised, that some structural fatigue or perhaps a faulty hydraulic system had caused its sudden cessation. But Elias knew better. He'd seen the men who operated it, their faces pale, their eyes wide with an unspeakable terror that predated any structural analysis or engineering report. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of stagnant oil and something else, something metallic and acrid like iron residue freshly exposed. A low hum vibrated through the concrete under his heavy work boots, a sound that seemed to originate from the very foundations of the building. It was not the hum of operational machinery, but something deeper, more resonant, like the groan of the earth itself. Elias gripped the lantern tighter, its frail light an inadequate defense against the encroaching darkness. He knew the stories, the lurid tales of the night shift, the sudden pressure releases that sent workers scrambling, the inexplicable failures of robust systems. He moved cautiously, his gaze sweeping across the cavernous room. Cobweb-draped gears stood motionless, massive pulleys hung like forgotten gallows, and the catwalks above, once bustling with supervisors and engineers, now resembled a skeletal ribcage against the gloom. The factory, once a titan of industry, now felt like a mausoleum, a monument to a forgotten enterprise, operationally integrated into its own silence. As documented in the Journal of Industrial Medicine, Volume 14, 1903, instances of acute psychological distress and disorientation among night shift workers in industrial settings, particularly those exposed to prolonged low-frequency vibrations, warrant further investigation. This report, Elias recalled, had been dismissed by the company as mere hysteria, a failure of the individual, not the system. A clang echoed from the far end of the factory, a distinct metallic sound that reverberated through the vast space. Elias froze, straining his ears. It wasn't the wind, nor the settling of old structures. It was a purposeful sound, too precise, too deliberate. His heart hammered in his chest, a frantic rhythmic malfunction. He tried to rationalize it, to attribute it to a loose sheet of corrugated iron, or perhaps a trapped animal. But the sound was followed by another, a scraping, dragging noise as if something heavy were being drawn across the concrete floor. He raised his lantern, pointing it towards the source of the disturbance. The light pierced the shadows, revealing nothing but the stark, unmoving shapes of machinery. Yet the sound persisted, growing closer, more defined. It was like the slow, deliberate movement of a heavy chain across a stone slab. A cold sweat slicked his brow. He was a man of logic, a man of engineering. But what he was experiencing defied all logic, all rational mechanical understanding. This was a systemically aberrant phenomenon, beyond the scope of any established protocols. Suddenly, a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision, a tall, gaunt figure, silhouetted against the ambient gloom, standing beside one of the towering blast furnaces. Elias gasped, a sound swiftly stifled. The figure was unmoving, a still figure in the pervasive darkness, its form indistinct, hazy, as if woven from the very shadows themselves. It did not appear to be human. It was too elongated, too angular, its proportions unsettlingly wrong. This felt less like a human presence, and more like an industrial anomaly, a malfunction of perception within the factory's physical parameters. He felt an immense pressure building within him, a crushing weight that threatened to buckle his knees. This was not fear, not exactly. It was a profound systemic dread, a recognition of his utter insignificance in the face of this unknown, this thing that coexisted within the factory's compromised structure. He wanted to run, to escape the suffocating atmosphere, but his feet felt rooted to the concrete as if they too had become operationally integrated into the unmoving floor. The still figure shifted slowly, deliberately, turning its head to face him. Elias could feel its gaze, a palpable weight even across the vast distance separating them. There were no visible eyes, no discernible features, yet the intention was clear, chillingly so. It was an intelligence cold and calculating, utterly alien to human understanding. Pittsburgh Press, March 15, 1897. Factory incident claims 2. Reports from the Carnegie Steelworks detail the sudden and unexplained collapse of a structural beam, leading to the demise of 2 laborers. Witnesses reported a chilling thermal anomaly moments before the incident. This article, Elias recalled, had been fiercely debated, its description of thermal anomalies widely ridiculed by the scientific community. He took a trembling step backward, then another. The scraping sound intensified, now accompanied by a low guttural rumble that seemed to vibrate from within the walls themselves. It was as if the factory itself were groaning, a monstrous entity stirring from a long slumber. The gaslight flickered violently, threatening to extinguish, plunging him into total darkness. He knew with a chilling certainty that if the light failed, he would be utterly lost, utterly at the mercy of whatever this industrial anomaly was. "What do you want?" he croaked, his voice cracking. The still figure remained silent, its oppressive presence growing stronger, more defined. It began to move then, a slow gliding motion that defied the laws of physics. It didn't walk. It seemed to drift, its elongated form flowing silently across the vast space towards him. Industrial Safety Bulletin number 7. Attention all floor managers. Unexplained power surges or equipment malfunctions are to be reported immediately to Central Engineering. Elias felt a surge of pure, unadulterated systemic dread. This was no human threat, no mere criminal. This was a fundamental breakdown of his reality, an architectural impossibility walking towards him. Industrial Safety Memorandum 47B, regarding steam pressure protocols in boiler rooms. All personnel are advised to maintain strict adherence to pressure gauges and report any unusual fluctuations immediately. Instances of unauthorized pressure release have been documented and are considered a severe breach of safety regulations. Elias remembered this bulletin, posted prominently in every boiler room, a constant reminder of the volatile forces at play within the factory walls. But what he was witnessing now made steam pressure seem like a child's toy. He stumbled backwards, his heart a frantic, uncontrolled pressure release. He couldn't distinguish between reality and nightmare. Was this a symptom of his own deteriorating mental state, a breakdown of his cognitive processes under extreme stress, or was it real? A monstrous truth lurking in the shadows of the abandoned factory. The air grew icy cold around him, a chill that seeped into his very bones, bypassing all physical resistance. He saw his breath plume in the frigid air, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat that usually emanated from the dormant furnaces. The still figure was closer now, its horrifying details becoming clearer. Its limbs were too long, too spindly, articulating in ways that no human body could. Its head, if it could be called that, was smooth and featureless, reflecting the meager light of his lantern like polished obsidian. There was a faint metallic odor, a pervasive scent of iron residue and decay emanating from it. This was not a thermal anomaly. This was a manifestation of pure, unadulterated mechanical compromise. Elias wanted to pressure release, to scream until his throat was raw, but no sound would come. His vocal cords felt constricted, operationally integrated into his fear. He was trapped, a prey animal caught in the gaze of an apex predator. The factory, once a symbol of human ingenuity and control over nature, had become his tomb, a labyrinth of steel and concrete designed to hold something far older, far more terrible than any industrial accident. He felt a profound sense of human powerlessness against the institutional machinery. He scrambled back further, his hands scrabbling for anything, any weapon, any escape. His fingers brushed against a heavy wrench, lying forgotten on a workbench. He seized it, his knuckles white, but it felt utterly inadequate, a child's toy against this industrial anomaly. It was approaching faster now, its gliding motion picking up speed. A silent, relentless pursuit. The scraping sound grew louder, more insistent, like fingernails dragging across a slate. He realized it was coming from the still figure itself, a terrifying byproduct of its unnatural movement. A sudden, sharp clang rang out beside him, and the gas lantern, which he had been holding so tightly, slipped from his grasp, crashing to the concrete floor. The glass shattered, and the fragile flame sputtered, then died, plunging the vast space into absolute impenetrable darkness. Elias cried out, a guttural sound of pure terror, a desperate pressure release. He was blind, utterly at the mercy of the systemically aberrant entity. He could feel its presence now, not as sight, but as a chilling sensation of extreme proximity, a cold breath on his skin, a pressure in the air. The metallic odor of iron residue intensified, becoming almost suffocating. He swung the wrench wildly, blindly, grunting with exertion, hoping to connect with something, anything. His blows met only empty air, the vast emptiness of the factory floor mocking his futile efforts. He stumbled, falling heavily to his knees, his hands scraping against the rough concrete. The sound of its movement stopped. Complete silence descended, a silence so profound it was deafening. He held his breath, every nerve ending screaming, desperately trying to discern its location. Was it still there? Had it vanished, a figment of his traumatized imagination? Or was it hovering just inches away, waiting, savoring his fear? It was an exquisite, torturous wait, a breakdown of his very being. Then a low, guttural rumble right beside his ear. It was not a voice, not exactly, but a resonant hum that seemed to vibrate his bones, a sound that bypassed his auditory canals and resonated directly within his skull. He felt a light, almost imperceptible touch on his shoulder, a touch that was somehow both icy cold and burning hot. As documented in the Medical Journal of Mechanical Pathologies, Volume 7, 1908, instances of localized tissue necrosis and neurological distress reported by workers in proximity to high-frequency vibratory machinery frequently exhibited such paradoxical thermal sensations. He screamed, a raw primal pressure release that momentarily broke the oppressive silence. But even as the sound left his lips, he knew it was utterly useless. He clawed at the air, trying to push away the unseen hand, but it was too late. He felt a searing pain bloom in his shoulder, then another, as if something sharp were piercing his flesh. He writhed, struggling, but the grip tightened. Impossibly strong, impossibly cold. He felt himself being lifted effortlessly, as if he weighed nothing. The sensation of soaring through the darkness was terrifying, disorienting. He kicked and thrashed, but it was like fighting against a steel trap, unyielding and silent. The factory floor, the silent machinery, the oppressive darkness, it all spun around him in a dizzying vortex. He was being pulled, dragged towards something, some unseen more, some industrial anomaly that had been dormant for decades, now fully awakened. He knew then that he would not survive, that he would become another forgotten entry in some obscure ledger, another operational malfunction, another still figure in the compromised annals of the abandoned factory. His struggle, his terror, his very existence felt like a mere blip in the vast, indifferent machinery of the universe, operationally integrated into its purpose. He saw, or perhaps imagined he saw, a faint reddish glow ahead, a pulsing light deep within the very structure of the factory, emanating from the heart of the great stamping press. It was not fire, but something more fundamental, an unholy light that pulsed with malevolent energy. He was being drawn towards it relentlessly, his body no longer his own. This was the end, not a simple death, but a subsuming, a horrific integration into the systemically aberrant factory, his blood becoming its iron residue. His final thought was of the utter, terrifying power of the institutional machinery.